Welcome to a Trekzone conversation today as the threat of potentially catastrophic bushfire conditions looms over the eastern seaboard of Australia. Brad and I are chatting about Voyager 2's solar system departure and a planet redefining our understanding of a star's transition to a red giant.
With Dr. Brad Tucker and Matt Miller, this is Talkin Science on Trekzone.
Well, welcome to Tuesday, welcome to Talkin Science, and we're outside for this morning because it is a beautiful morning here in Brisbane, but the smoke haze is continuing. We'll dive into that in a second. Dr. Brad Tucker is with me from the south coast of New South Wales. Good morning, Brad.
Yeah, how's it going?
Really good, really good. One of the topics that we want to cover today is this bushfire threat that is looming large across much of the eastern seaboard of Australia, and it's especially relevant for you this morning with where you are doing some remote observing.
Yeah, so we're at one of our remote facilities in the south coast. We were actually having a meeting about space health, so we're planning to do space medicine, but we are just getting evacuated now. We're not under the threat of bushfire. They've just changed the fire conditions because it's getting hot, it's getting windy, and that means that if there is a spark, it turns quite bad. Whereas we were also remote observing at Siding Springs, so our facility where all our big telescopes are, and that has been closed to the threat of bushfire. There's nothing in the immediate area, but again, the conditions are right that they don't want staff on site in the event that something goes wrong.
It's incredible because when I first met you, Brad, back in 2016, and in fact it's coming up on Talkin Science in 60 seconds tomorrow, when we met you at Mount Stromlo, we talked about the Canberra bushfires of 2003, which decimated the observatory there. It's very difficult, really, isn't it, where we have to place observatories and telescopes in Australia is in these bushfire risk zones.
That's exactly right. You know, we put them in very remote rural places, and sometimes because of that, it means that you are in quite thick area. And, you know, this happened to Mount Stromlo in 2003, as you were saying, and it was it's been the only major observatory that has burnt down. That hasn't happened in the past. But that said, it's the sort of thing where we've learned lessons from it, both based on clearing of brush, the way we build the buildings, and the way we have our people around the telescopes on site. And that means we have to be safe. And it's only going to get worse as the environment gets worse and the threat of fires gets greater, especially as the drought persists.
I was looking at the stats with this fire. New South Wales especially is under some pretty heavy attack, if you will, from the fires. Queensland is burning, but not as badly. There's been approximately 970,000 hectares burnt or currently burning in New South Wales as we record. To put that into a bit of context for our US listeners, 766,000 hectares was burnt during the devastating Californian wildfires last year, and they were the deadliest on record. So it really shows in perspective, you know, what's happening in Australia at the moment, and it might be making news internationally with the way that it is. But interestingly, in Australia, and unfortunately, we've had a couple of people who have perished in these fires compared to California, with a denser population at 97 civilians and 6 firefighters killed. So this is a very real threat, but one technology that the firies are using to battle these fires is satellites, satellite imagery and satellite tracking and all that sort of stuff as well, isn't it?
It is. You know, it's one of the things that we often forget about what we use space and satellites for, and that is what we call Earth observation, seeing what's going on the Earth. And a big part of that is for fire management. You know, that is the reality of what we have to do, especially when you have a big continent and a big place. And in a place like Australia, where because it's less densely populated, you don't have a lot of observing outposts or people to actually see it. You're observing from space. And there's been some incredible photos of seeing how the plume of smoke, how the fire is spreading, and what groups like us are trying to do is actually to build instruments to actually from space be able to see what the moisture and ground and water content is on the ground, because if you can see how wet the ground is or how much water's underneath, it will also help you predict fire loads, which is a big part of fighting firefighters.
Well, the New South Wales Department of Education has advised parents, I believe across the state, to keep their children home if they so desire. There are 575 schools across the state that have been closed due to the bushfire threat, and I guess the recommendation, Brad, is that while the students aren't at school, they can keep learning by listening to us here on Talking Science. Isn't that right?
Well, that's right. And it's not trying to make light of what's going on. This is very real to both of us, in fact, right now.
Absolutely, yes.
But, it is that this is the way we have to tackle these things, and it's to learn from it, and it's to use the tools and to build new tools that could directly help in these devastating bushfires or other emergencies. And I think we forget just how big a role space does in that. It's easy to say space is all about exploration and stuff, which it is, and it's really cool. And then when people say, well, what is it, the practical side? There is a very real practical side that when it, matters most, space is there to try and help.
You can get social with Trekzone. Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek is everywhere you are. Get the wrap-up on our Facebook page. Keep in the loop on Twitter and relive Trek episodes on Instagram. Just search for Trekzone.
We can turn our gaze skyward and hopefully with a good solar filter, because we want to be looking at the sun, unless you're in Australia, because you're either battling the bushfires or the sun has set during Mercury's transit.
Yeah, so today is a very rare opportunity to see what we call the transit of Mercury. And now, as you said, Australia is in the exact wrong spot of the Earth to see this. But the transit of Mercury is literally as it sounds. It is when Mercury moves across the face of the sun with respect to the Earth. So it does a transit. Now, there's a lot of reasons I like this. It's literally the exact same technique we use to find planets around other stars. We see them transit in front of their star. And, so it's a nice way to see this very physical thing that happens in our own solar system. The transit of Mercury and the way Mercury moves around the sun was used to confirm Einstein's theory of relativity, so it has a big history in science. And it is a fairly rare thing to see, which is quite exciting.
Well, it has now wrapped up. It kicked off at about 12:30 GMT and lasted for 5.5 hours. And the images that we've got on the show now are really cool. It really is just this black dot crossing this massive star.
And it moves very slowly, but it tells us the size of Mercury. It tells us how fast it is or how close its orbit is. And some of its weird effects, as I said early on, really helped us understand general theory of relativity. So a very important thing that has been a big part. And so transits have always been a big part of planets in our solar system and fundamental measurements. And it is a rare opportunity. The next one is not till 2032.
I'll be a little bit older. We'll both be a little bit older at that point, won't we?
It's in a little bit wild. We've kind of been lucky because there's been a series where there was one in 2003. I remember it was May 2003 because like a few days before I graduated university.
Oh, wow.
Another one in 2006. And then we had another set in 2016 and today with being this series. And then, we have this big gap till November 2032. So literally 13 years from now.
Well, something that took 13 years plus a couple of decades is Voyager 2 to leave the solar system.
A tad longer than a transit, luckily. And this was a really cool thing that's happened. Voyager 2 is a probe like Voyager 1, built in the 70s to go image the gas giants. And it's headed out, and I think we still fail to realize the impact of Voyager 2. All of our images, essentially, of Uranus and Neptune still come from the Voyager probes. When you look at a photo of Uranus and Neptune, it is still from Voyager back in the 70s. We haven't sent anything else.
That's incredible.
Well, it is, and it was the same thing with Jupiter until we sent Juno. I think we appreciate how big these missions were and how kind of groundbreaking they were thinking about, because even though they were launched in the 70s, it took them years to build. And so they had to start planning and funding it back in the 60s. And if you think about back in the 60s, this is only a few years after satellites came into existence, essentially. So you're talking about one of the very first big things they decided to do was to build 2 probes and just send them out to go see the big planets on the edge of our solar system, and then just have them keep going. And that's what they've been doing.
I think the incredible thing about the mission is that they just kept going, and now they're in interplanetary space.
They are.
Interstellar space, excuse me.
Interstellar space, that's right. So Voyager 1 passed what we call out of the heliopause. And so our sun, when it emits light, it's a big ball of plasma. And this light and plasma forms essentially an edge, a bubble where you have a limit. And Voyager 1 passed through it. Now, the great thing about Voyager 2 was it was heading in a different direction. And so the question was, hey, will it leave at the same distance? Will it have the same, view of it leaving the heliopause? Or will it be something different? And when it left about a year ago, and after analyzing the data, they see that it left pretty much at the same spot Voyager 1 did in relative terms, and that there really is like a sharp edge, like a bubble, that the heat and the light bubble from our sun extends into space and then just stops. And if you leave it, there's nothing else. You literally are in interstellar space in the truest sense.
And the brilliant thing for us Aussies is that Glenn Nagel and his team down at Tidbinbilla are pretty much the prime receiving station for these probes now.
There pretty much is one of the few dishes that is big enough to download all the data. They were downloading Voyager 2 again yesterday, because they literally have a tape deck on Voyager. And in fact, there's a cool tweet by Tidbinbilla where you can actually see the pause in data transmission when they actually have to change tape decks on Voyager 2 to send their information. And look, at some point, it will run out of energy and it will stop, and it will stop transmitting data. But until then, we'll keep looking at it. I mean, I think the other kind of cool consequence of this, as we see, is if we talk about using solar panels or solar power or solar light as like a solar sail, once you get past this boundary, you can't do that. None of that works. And again, that puts into scale. It's a relatively short distance that goes out to when you enter this interstellar space, you can't use any of these other techniques from the sun, or you can't keep using them from the sun. And that we'll have to figuring out in terms of traveling to these other stars. What other techniques can we use to make it happen?
Well, one of the stars that we might want to visit is HD 212771, or possibly even HD 203949. Some red giants that have got some interesting stories to tell.
Yeah, so, our sun will turn into a red giant in the future. Luckily, not for billions and billions of years. And the assumption is as the sun turns into a red giant and it puffs out, it will slowly expand, and then it will swallow up Mercury, and it'll swallow up Venus, and then it will probably swallow up Earth. Mars should be safe. And in this process, it will destroy the planets, and that's kind of it. And so there shouldn't be planets nearby around a red giant. But these 2 stars, it appears that they've gone through the red giant phase, and then after you go through your red giant phase, you puff out and then you shrink back down. And it appears that there's planets really nearby the star that shouldn't be there if that star just turned into a red giant and destroyed it, which is actually questioning how do solar systems survive this red giant expanding phase? And
I've just learnt a new field of study as well, astroseismology, which is helping this study and also finding exoplanets as well. It is.
Astroseismology is really seeing the minute vibrations and the minute movements of stars, and really being able to see the inside structure of a star by observing it quite frequently. And this is something the Kepler Space Telescope did. By observing every 30 minutes, you can see how the star changes its light and pulses, and actually see, is it pulsing and getting it bigger slowly like a red giant, or is it shrinking? And it's told us a lot about the structures of stars. It's a really cool field. And if you want to understand how the planet goes around that star, it's a very cool technique to study the star system. And it really has told us a lot about this internal structure and process. And these stars, they know we're red giants. And it's really interesting to see, did the planet, there's a theory that says, well, maybe as the star expanded, the gravity would have pushed it out, right? Your gravity profile, so to speak, expands. So maybe the star or the planet naturally just migrated away. Maybe this planet naturally backed up to get at a safe distance because of gravity, and then it came back in as the star shrunk, and then therefore the gravity changed as well. That could be a really interesting physical thing that tells us how planets survive their stars.
The thing I love is that this planet is huge. It's a gas giant. It's about 8 times bigger than Jupiter. There's a bit of scale involved here.
Yeah, it is a very large planet. And maybe it was that this planet just started really far out and then got pulled back in because as the star expanded, again, gravity changed. So it did the reverse, and it pulled it in and then pulled it into a safe pocket around its star. So, what we call planet migration, how planets move in a solar system, is a big thing people are trying to understand, because it does not appear that planets stay still for very long. And it's kind of weird to think about when we think of our solar system, and we think it does. Well, over a long enough time, that is not the case, that these planets do move around. And so it maybe gives us a glimpse into what will happen to our solar system in the future. Fantastic,
Brad. Well, speaking of moving around, I think we better let you go and get out of harm's way, if indeed it is coming. Hopefully not. Hopefully today's catastrophic day of fires is an over precaution, and things don't pan out as bad as what authorities are predicting.
Yes, that's what we hope. I'm always happy with over precaution, to be honest.
Absolutely, Brad. All right, well, I was going to say talk safe, but Brad, be safe, and we'll talk again next week.
Sounds good.